Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 4th of May, 2025, and here we are with a live stream returning to a popular, always popular topic, which is the question of what is going on with regard to the so-called negotiations between the United States and Russia and what any of this actually means. Because when Trump, who, lest we forget, is apparently president of the United States, though his similarities to Biden escalate by the day, when he was first in office, there was a wave of, you might call it enthusiasm, from certain multipolarist type commentators that Trump was going to be the president of peace, etc. That this was going to be that he was going to negotiate an end to the Ukraine war. That this was going to be, some of the more wild overestimations of what Trump was going to do involved him negotiating an end to all of the conflicts. He was going to end the war on Gaza. He was going to end the hostility towards Iran. He was going to even do a deal with China. Now, after his first 100 days in power, it becomes obvious just how little change Trump is going to actually make when it comes to the questions of war and peace, and also just how much of his attempt to revive, or how his faction would see it, that is, revive the US state machine via by aggressive cutbacks to certain programs and certain areas, how this was going to destroy the deep state, etc., etc. Now, all of this has turned into complete dust, ashes in the mouth, shall we say. And we're going to be exploring a little bit about why. But first of all, we will get to those who are in the chat, and we will do some greetings. Everybody be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. So we have in the chat thus far, we have Arcane Eclectic. Good evening to you. We have Jerry. We have Thomas Wolfe joining us from southeastern Oklahoma. We have Chandler joining us from the Future People's Republic of Cascadia. Is that Canada? I could be wrong about that. Do correct me if I'm wrong. Edward, a Latvian comrade in Iceland. President Jesus out there in the perpetual dictatorship of Gavin Newsom. We have Working Prole Incorporated, Sun Chu, Rob, and Beans, who are over on the wrong side of the Pennines. We have James Graham, who says Z, and I say Z back to you. We have Grassy Knoll coming to us from Seattle, Washington. We have Comrade Ian Foster. We have Comrade Daniel from Somerset. We have Irish Partisan, who says, today is the 45th anniversary of the death of Tito, of course. Tito died in 1980, and the state which he didn't create, but he gave new life to, didn't last barely a decade after him. Though interestingly enough, and this is a bit of a diversion, research into Yugoslav identity points to the fact that by the time that Yugoslavia was dissolved by the actions of what I would call comprador bourgeoisie in Croatia, in Bosnia, elements of them in Serbia as well, though it was the Serbs that fought the hardest to retain the unity of Yugoslavia, and of course in Slovenia. Well, by the time the dissolution of Yugoslavia occurred, the number of people across all of the constituent republics identifying as Yugoslav had actually never been higher, which seems strange when you think of it in terms of why is there this disparity between the people who actually identified as Yugoslav and the fact that the nation disintegrated shortly afterwards. And the answer comes back again to a question we always return to here, which is that having a lot of opinions on your side, or having the majority of the population be in favor of something, means very little unless there are forces organized to actually put that will that exists on paper into action. So, for instance, the March 1991 referendums in the Soviet Union revealed that well over 75%, I think it was, of those polled, so and even in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, the Central Asian states, Azerbaijan, wanted to preserve the Soviet Union. It was only a sizable but still much, much, much smaller minority that wanted it to be dissolved. And yet those who wished it to be dissolved won. Why? Same in Yugoslavia, because the comprador elements, those who wanted to dissolve these socialist states, or a people's democracy, if you will, about Yugoslavia. I realize there are varying opinions as to the nature of the Yugoslav system, but it's no good having a passive amount of support on a particular question if there's no force there to actually fight for it. In the case of the Soviet Union, the force that was meant to fight for it had been decapitated and destroyed, which is the CPSU. It had been decapitated by its own leadership and crippled by its own leadership following years of revisionist rot that couldn't be turned around in time to save the USSR, despite the fact that the great majority of the population wanted it to be preserved. In Yugoslavia, despite the fact that there were more actual self-identifying Yugoslavs than ever, the Yugoslav League of Communists, again, was decapitated by its own leaders, particularly in like Croatia and Slovenia. And so, again, like the party that was meant to fight for harder than anything to preserve the socialist systems, it was the party itself that was the problem, and so relatively small numbers of compradors in Yugoslavia managed to destroy the state because the proletariat had become disorganized and ideologically disarmed, and the leaders of the state had become rotten and politically weak, or both. And the fall of Yugoslavia is something we're going to come back to next week when I've completed my notes on the final decade of the Yugoslav system. So next week, tune in for a live stream on that. Right. Okay. Hello to Svetlana in Moscow. President Jesus says, but apparently make America healthy again is revolutionary. If that's revolutionary, then quite frankly, people's standards have fallen very, very low. I mean, I think I'm sure there's a reference to a certain Mr. James Dorr, the failing and flailing comedian. Will Johnson, good evening to you. Zain Mudassir, hello to you. Almir joins us from the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Hello to Enigma. Hello to Roddy. Hello to Chris Conway, joining us from Salt Lake City. Hello to Grassy Knoll and to Nasukani Brod, who joins us from Croatia, the once and future Yugoslavia. Hello to Victor, Andrew Jenkins from Perfidious Albion. Hello to Gonzalo Cabrera from Madrid. Hello to Alan Smith from Georgia, the future Socialist Republic of the USA. Let's hope so. So here we will get into the topic in question, which is why are the negotiations that Trump instigated at terrific fanfare over when he came into office, why are these just not going anywhere? And the answer is, of course, well, it's as always, it's rather multifaceted, which is that the way in which that this is done, is to it is essentially a series of deceptions which has been perpetrated here, partially by Trump himself, partially by those around him, partially by his excuse makers in the media. And the problem that we have when trying to make sense of this is to see through the cosmetic changes. Now, it was, and I've made this point over and over again, it was never going to be the case that Trump was going to be able to reverse all of the policies that had led the U.S. imperialists up to the point of being so heavily involved to the point of planning every single Ukrainian attack, it seems, along with the British. Trump was never going to be able to reverse that without suffering very significant political damage. So Trump, in theory, could have come in and on day one said, well, nothing more to Ukraine, no more money, no more weaponry. We're pulling out the teams that have been planning this war. We're pulling out everything, and we're basically say if the Europeans want to carry on with this war, we'll leave it up to them. Now, he could, in theory, have tried to do that. In practice, the entire machinery of the State Department, or a great bulk of it, the Department of Defense, and a significant section of the Republican Party, along with all of the Democratic Party in Congress, would have moved to block all of this. This is the thing. So Trump, even if he had the will to do it and had unity amongst his cabinet around doing this, he would have been blocked from doing it. And Trump doesn't have unity in his cabinet. He doesn't have unity in his party. The ruling class in the United States themselves seem very split on the issue. On the one hand, they have reached the point of realization that they are not going to be able to use the Ukrainians to deliver any kind of military defeat to the Russians. They know very well that the sanctions have not worked. In actual fact, it seems to have actually rather helped Russia become more sovereign and independent and able to plot more of its own path than would have been the case otherwise. It's actually wounded and weakened those elements within the Russian Federation who were most tied to the West. So this has not worked. The policy, they know it hasn't worked. They know that they can't carry on in the way that they have done and expect to gain any kind of victory. The problem that they have, though, is that they don't know what else to do. So if they followed the course that I suggested a moment ago, if Trump followed the course of just cutting off Ukraine, Ukraine would fall very quickly and implode, and the Russians would be able to finish the war on their terms. The US ruling class knows that they can't carry on with the current policy, but they don't want that result either. They don't want the sudden and dramatic implosion because it might lead to, well, it would lead to a significant global embarrassment for US imperialism and a very big loss of credibility. And so the US ruling class does not want that, but they don't know what else to do either. So they're stuck. So they bring in Trump to try and do what? And again, this is a point I have made on numerous occasions before, but I am going to make it again. Trump was brought in to deliver upon, I think, the policy that Biden had been talking about, or more to the point that Blinken had been talking about, which is the policy of trying to freeze the conflict, in actual fact, trying to reach a point where they can essentially repair the damage, so they think, that has been done to Ukraine. I don't think you can repair the amount of damage that has been done to Ukraine in terms of population loss, both by casualties in the war and by the millions who have fled Ukraine, the biggest single number of which have gone to Russia, by the way. So the idea being, and again, Blinken was toying with this, was to temporarily acknowledge that Crimea was lost, temporarily acknowledge that Donetsk and Lugansk were lost, and then go back to the drawing board with regard to Ukraine and try and rebuild Ukraine and rebuild its armed capacity. Essentially, then try and fill Ukraine with NATO trainers or peacekeepers, if you will, and then relaunch the war in a few years' time. And that would be the plan that the Biden administration was starting to talk about. But Biden, of course, the Biden administration wasn't going to ever open up negotiations with the Russians over that. So Trump was assigned the task of essentially delivering upon that plan by being able to actually open up negotiations. So they opened up the negotiations only to find that the Russians weren't going to go for what they were offering. because the only thing the US is prepared, really prepared, to actually offer the Russians, and I'm not talking about Trump here. Trump says a lot and often doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. I'm talking about those who actually make the policies that become or draft the policies that become the doctrines of presidents. The think tank world, which is of course funded to do the literal thinking on behalf of the ruling class. The only thing that world is prepared to offer the Russians is the frozen conflict. That's it. So it's not just a matter of like Zelensky being intransigent. He's being obstreperous, shall we say, and refusing to agree to anything because he's got the bulk of the European powers behind him, because he has significant support within the U.S. state machine, because on the ground in Ukraine, he also has the guns of the fascist elements pointing at the back of his head. So he can not afford to be anything other than belligerent, other than be perpetually refusing to actually engage in negotiations or make even temporary concessions. And the US, if they tried to force those concessions, if they tried to basically tell Zelensky, no, you have to sign up to this, otherwise we are cutting you off, they would risk a coup in Kiev, they would risk the destabilization of Ukraine, they would risk it collapsing. And because they're desperate to avoid that, they're kind of stuck. They can't go forward, they can't go backwards. And this is the dilemma that is now confronting Trump. Trump, probably himself and those around him, planned to essentially fob off the Russians with some kind of like frozen conflict scenario where what the Russians have got total control of now is temporarily acknowledged to be outside of Ukraine, and then everything else is frozen. Well, of course, that wouldn't be good for the Russians, because what that leaves Ukraine with is the ability to actually be included de facto into some kind of NATO system, and of course, we know from the revelations in the New York Times and the Times of London about the extent of the US and British control over the war, that they are already very much embedded within the Ukrainian military, that is the NATO powers. So we know from the amount of British, American, French officers who have been, well, some of whom have been killed in Ukraine, and we know from the articles covering them and their role that there's already total control exercised over the Ukrainian armed forces by the big NATO powers. In all but name, this is a NATO army. So why on earth would the Russians now leave or stop their operation and leave essentially NATO in control of Ukraine? Because that's what the offer that's on the table, that has been on the table from the Trump administration, essentially does. It's not just the Kellogg plan. Kellogg didn't come up with this. He's put his name on it. His name's been put on it. But this is a plan that's been floating around about freezing the conflict for years, for well over a year. And they keep trying to sell this, but the Russians keep going back to their fundamentals, which is that this whole thing was really about NATO expansion, but also the turning of Ukraine into, as we've said before here, a battering ram to be used against the Russians. And if the Russian government signs up to any deal where the usage of Ukraine as a battering ram is in any way accepted, or it gives the NATO powers the ability to rebuild Ukrainian forces again, however weakened a condition they are in, to further make trouble for the Russians and further try to destabilize Russia, then the special military operation will have been for nothing, if that ability to continue to arm and bolster the Kiev regime is left in the hands of the NATO powers. So this is why negotiations are stuck, because the ruling classes of the US, Britain, France, and to an extent, I think, Germany as well, they know that they can't win, but they don't want to acknowledge that they've lost, and they do not want to give up the project in Ukraine. So the people say, oh, Keir Starmer's obsessed with Ukraine. Well, only as much as Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were, because it's a very important project for the British ruling class and always has been. And therefore, they're not going to give that up. They were never going to give that up. And the US wasn't really intending to just give up Ukraine either. They wanted to lessen their involvement in it to a degree. They wanted to dispose of it onto the Europeans and have this thing managed to some sort of conclusion, but they couldn't agree on what that conclusion should be. And so you've ended up in this position where essentially by not being able to agree anything, being terribly afraid of showing weakness, being terribly afraid of being seen to have lost, what the US is essentially doing now under Trump is cruising towards, or shall we say, staggering towards a catastrophic loss, because eventually, with the US now declaring that it's not involved in negotiations and it will have to be done negotiated between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which is always a farce because Ukraine has no agency whatsoever. It's completely dependent upon the funding and the orders issued by its foreign backers. The idea that the US was ever a mediator when it essentially ran the war, I mean, it's then no more of a mediator than the British are. But they are going to essentially leave Ukraine to be dismantled. And so what is going to happen is that eventually the Russians are going to make their move, and they are going to they're going to have to end the Kiev regime by armed force. Now, will it come to the point when the US or the British will have to acknowledge somehow that this thing is going down in flames, that the Kiev regime is fucked? I don't think they will ever acknowledge that. I think that they will continue to extend the war as long as they can, even if there's a siege of Kiev, even if Zelensky and his clique flee with their ill-gotten gains to the west, even if the Russian army goes all the way to Odessa, even if a new Ukrainian state is established and then essentially set up as a pro-Russian Ukrainian state, even if all that is done, I don't think that the US or any of the Western Europeans will acknowledge that the war has been lost. They will privately acknowledge it, but they won't be able to publicly acknowledge it. They'll continue to exclaim that they'll back the rightful government of the heroic Mr. Zelensky before Zelensky is found following a horrific overdose of cocaine and Viagra in his pool in Florida. And has to be buried in a T-shaped coffin. The whole question of whether there could ever be a negotiated peace needs to be looked at in the sense of, well, it's not just a question of what Trump wants or what Rubio wants or Steve Witkoff wants. It's a question of what are the requirements of the U.S. ruling class, and the requirements of the U.S. ruling class have not changed. And they are not necessarily always lined up with, but they do run alongside the requirements of the ruling classes of Britain, France, and Germany. And this isn't just about, of course, the need to restore Yeltsinism in Russia or the need to break up Russia, which, of course, is something that the European officials like Kaja Kallas have openly talked about. This is about much more than that now. It's about also the power of the neo-colonial system in places like sub-Saharan Africa. It's about the fact that regardless of the intentions of some of the people in the government of the Russian Federation, who would probably not have wanted this, regardless of those intentions, that they have ended up becoming symbols of defiance of Western imperialism. If you look at places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and some other countries now, people wave Russian flags as symbols of defiance. And you look at the slow but steady development of the BRICS system. You look at the ability of countries to remove themselves from the domination of the US-led global neo-colonial system that they've run for 30 years. And you can see that this war and the role of the Russians has become about far, far more than just what happens to Ukraine or what happens about NATO expansion. It's become an existential question of the entire US-led system going down in flames. And that is why they, in every situation now, they can't go forward and they can't go back. So they can't go forward with regard to negotiations with the Russians because they can offer nothing that the Russians will take. They can't retreat because that will only confirm their weakness and confirm that in the eyes of the oppressed nations and peoples of the world, that the US's time in the sun has come to a close. And they can't do, and that's not just on Ukraine that they can't do it. They can't resolve this either. They can't. They don't know what to do about Israel as well. They're stuck there. The U.S. ruling class and the U.S. Should we say U.S. ruling class intellectuals are split amongst themselves as to exactly what they want to do. Some of the wilder elements want to go ahead with full-blown ethnic cleansing, or shall I say, continue the policy of full-blown ethnic cleansing when it comes to not just Gaza but the West Bank, and use the Zionists in their traditional way of brutalizing the Arab population and carrying out vast population transfers and expulsions. Others in the US ruling class's intellectual environment are much more circumspect about this and fear the potential repercussions of such a move, both inside West Asia and domestically as well. Same is true for what is going on with regard to Iran. You can see quite clearly there that there are some in the US state machine that desperately want some kind of war, but they are stuck because the Iranians have spent 40 plus years developing, well, let's just say more 30 years since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, developing a defensive doctrine that will cause maximum damage to the United States if they dare attack Iran. So again, they're stuck resorting to the same old tactics of terrorism and regime change tactics, which, of course, Trump inadvertently has ended up undermining himself by revealing all the tricks of US aid and the NED, the tricks that were very much public, which were well known about if you study these things. But Trump, by lifting the lid on these agencies in the way that he did, has ended up damaging the US's ability to carry out the very operations that they used to place so much value on. So again, they don't know what to do with Iran. They don't really know what to do with the Chinese either, even though they all keep saying they're going to pivot to Asia and pivot to China. But how are they going to approach that? The only policy they've got, well, they tried things in Hong Kong, they tried things in Xinjiang. They will try to stir up things in Taiwan and around, possibly around the Philippines as well. But again, they have very much a diminished ability to actually act. And so everywhere you look, the US is stuck because they have essentially fought arrogantly that they could twist and turn their policies and revive the US's fortunes by dramatically assailing certain bits of the US state machine and shaking things up and rebranding and pivoting, but they're unable to pivot. And they're unable to pivot because the same dilemma keeps hitting them in the face, which is that if they pivot away from Ukraine, Ukraine will fall. And that will look astonishingly bad for the US. It will look like they have lost because they have. And if they don't pivot away from it, they're going to end up going down to a defeat anyway, because the Russians have already destroyed several Ukrainian armies, and the Russians have a hell of a lot of men in reserve, and their war production capacity keeps going up. And they have, as it turns out, very effective allies in the form of the DPRK. And everything that the US and the Brits have tried has failed. So this is what's happening now. Trump is stuck, and it would be the same would be true, by the way, if it was Kamala Harris, if it was Mitt Romney, if it was AOC, if it was Bernie fucking Sanders, who I think would probably be even worse. Whoever came in and tried to reorganize things and tried to change US policy, they would run into the same problems, which is that the US state machine is obsessed with its credibility. But by being obsessed with its credibility and therefore being unable to actually change policy, they end up digging themselves into a deeper and deeper and deeper hole. So this is the way things stand at the moment. The US is stuck, going nowhere, going down to a defeat in actual fact, can't get out of Ukraine, don't know what to do about West Asia either, so keep trying the same old failed policies. I mean, look at what is going on in Yemen. They've been bombing Yemen relentlessly for months now, as was Biden, and Operation Prosperity Guardian, which sounds like a sort of really low-rent Marvel spin-off. The point is that they don't know what to do. They have no ability to affect things in the way that they think they should. And the system, the global neocolonial system, is slowly falling to pieces. The chance to change this passed a long time ago, and I don't think there's an argument to say it never really existed, because to actually change away from the policies of global aggression that US imperialism has been engaging in for, of course, the last 30 years, would mean actually disassembling the machinery of US imperialism itself, which no ruling class can ever really do. They might end up disassembling their own imperial machinery by accident, or falling over themselves in an attempt to reform, as many ruling classes have done in the past. Like the worst thing the old feudal aristocrats could have done in the pre-revolutionary France was try and reform themselves, and then the whole system shakes to pieces, because that's what happens sometimes when a rotten system is its rulers try to shake it up. This is typical of what happens in the late stage of a declining system, which is you end up stuck, can't go forward, can't go backwards. And so the rulers try to shake things up in various different ways, and it all fails. Now, the next phase of this will depend upon, I think, largely what goes on inside the US domestically with regard to particularly the US economy, which is looking very shaky. The Trump tariff clusterfuck has shown the deep instability within the system. It's also shown that the ruling class themselves don't really know what to do. They actually thought they could tariff China into submission, and it just hasn't worked. And anybody who's done even a modicum of study about China that wasn't some sort of hatchet job think tank piece of bullshit could tell you that this tariff thing wasn't going to work. The Chinese had been preparing for it for many, many years and were ready when Trump finally unleashed it. Hence now Trump's all over the place. So this is a system that is declining but stuck, and is unable to change course in Ukraine or anywhere else. So I will now stop and go through some further questions from the floor. Right, okay. Alan Smith says, this was the one good thing I expected of Trump, and he couldn't even deliver. Hello to Motor 1917. I did hear a theory today that the US will walk and sell their 4,200 tanks to the EU to keep them supplied. I don't think they're going to do that. I mean, they might sell some, but the US won't want to sell its entire tank fleets to the EU. I mean, I think that would also be a question of damaging credibility, basically. Irish Partisan says, Trump is Nixon redux. Nixon in 1968 pledged to end the Vietnam War and began talks with Hanoi, but chose to drag his feet to get the best possible outcome for the US. He was, in the end, forced to concede to Hanoi's demands at Paris talks in 1973. So Ukraine in 2025 eerily resembles, eerily similar to Vietnam 68 to 75. Yes, that's correct. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between Trump and Nixon, particularly with the obsession that they could sort of bully their way to some kind of favorable peace deal, and they end up not being able to do anything. And I think it's going to happen a lot quicker than in 5 years. So I think by this time next year, the Russians will have finished off the Kiev regime. It's just a question of how quickly they want to do it. Almir says, it's now clear to me that the Russian government absolutely understands the fake ceasefire freeze strategy of Trump's administration. Yeah, I think they do. there was a lot of criticism of them by various commentators that they would even indulge the Trump administration. But I think that this is partially about the internal dynamics of the Putin system, about the various different factions that exist in the Putin system, some of which do want to see a restoration of relations with the West. And so they engaged in the negotiations. They stuck to their position. The Trump administration just engaged in loads of bullshitting about the progress they were making. And in reality, no progress was made. So the Russians just simply kept restating their position. And the Americans weren't able to make any progress because the Americans weren't offering any concessions to Russian concerns at all. Tracy Wilkinson says, each successive US administration just continues the same foreign policy. Yes, very true, as Putin observed. Keel Jones says, make Ukraine great again. And Svetlana correctly replies, I assume you mean make Ukraine Soviet again. Exactly right. Daniel says, in comparing Vietnam and Ukraine, imagine if the working class of the West was protesting against supporting Ukraine. Things could have gone very differently. Very true. Unfortunately, well, we might end up with some protests, given how things could get rather extreme when the economic crisis renews itself with more urgency, which might happen quite soon. But there's been one of the reasons why there's not been protests against what's gone on with regard to the policy on Ukraine is that the entirety of the Western left and the official leaders of the so-called working class movement have systematically lied about it and parroted ruling class propaganda. And that's the reason why we don't get protests that over the tremendously dangerous and expensive policies pursued by the ruling class with regard to Ukraine. It's because there's other than my own party in this country, CPG-BML, or the ACP in the United States, and the other parties signed up to the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, there's very few parties who actually are putting forward these critiques. President Jesus says, what do you think of John Helmer's analysis that Trump wants friends and favorable industries to make more money out of the conflict than they did under Biden? I mean, that would fit with Trump's crude understanding of things. I mean, Trump tried like a smash and grab raid with that mineral deal, which I think might have been a bit of a stitch-up attempt by some people in the Trump administration. They wanted Ukraine to publicly reject the deal so that they could justify pulling out. But of course, then the different rival factions contended for influence over how that was going to move. So Trump, I think what was probably been done, what will be done to convince Trump about continuing with the war, will be two things. One, he'll be told that if he just pulls out, it will damage U.S. credibility, and then he and the U.S. will look weak, and therefore he better not do that. Second of all, it will be sold to him that, we can make a lot of money out of this war, Mr. President. See how much money was made in Afghanistan? We can make a ton of money out of this. And that's the way the Rubio types will pitch it to Trump. And Trump's fucking dumb and vain enough that he'll go for anything that tickles his ego in the right way. So that would be how it is sold to him. But it just shows that Trump, again, doesn't actually understand the system that he's running very well. Jerry says, let's have a look here. In order to have a ceasefire of more than a couple of days, there needs to be agreement on every inch of a very long border. Well, there needs to be an agreement. In order to have an actual ceasefire and negotiations, there needs to be the basis of agreement over like, well, what's going to be discussed at the peace talks, like what is actually on the table. And the US can't offer anything because there's no consensus on their side over what they should offer the Russians. The most they're actually prepared to offer is like the frozen conflicts and then the preservation of the Kiev regime, which the Russians can't accept. So that this is why they're stuck. They can't even agree upon the basis for negotiations. CD5 says, when is China getting involved? Well, they're already involved. They're already involved in terms of their trade with the Russians. They're already involved in terms of their role that they play in BRICS. They're already involved, I think, in terms of Chinese PLA officers studying the war and learning from it. So China is involved. It's just that they're not playing a publicly acknowledged military role the way that the way that People's Korea is. Edward says, well, will Russia ever launch a large-scale offensive? All the Putin system does is for 3 years do a 1 million plus bloody grind with limited resources. The Russian capitalist class can try and negotiate with the West. Well, there's some valid points there from Edward. I think that there will have to be offensives to end this in the end, because the Russian capitalist class would probably love a deal from Trump. Trump cannot and will not offer them one that the Russian government can accept, because it would lead to because all of the offers so far have looked as it have essentially asked the Russians to capitulate and to give up too much. And with so many Russians having died, I mean, we're talking like possibly in excess of 50,000, according to some estimates. So, with not nearly as many as have been killed on the Ukrainian side, of course, but the Russians, with the level of sacrifice they've endured, will not be able to agree to the capitulation that Trump wants them to sign. So, this is again one of the reasons why things are stuck. Clementine says it's already been publicly acknowledged in the US that Ukraine has lost. Well, it has and it hasn't. It's been publicly acknowledged by some people close to the administration. However, there is more in the power sources or centers of power in the US system than simply the presidency or the White House. There is, of course, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and that's just the official power structures. Then you have the military, you have the permanent bureaucracy, you have the think tank world. And so many of them now know that they can't ever get a win on the battlefield. But also bear in mind, it was never really about winning on the battlefield. It was about being able to portray yourself as having the opportunity to win on the battlefield, and being able to psyop the Russians or the Russian population into thinking that Ukraine was winning on the battlefield, and combining that with other operations, including what they hoped would be economic collapse via the imposition of the sanctions. And that would produce the outcome they were looking for, which is political destabilization inside Russia itself. None of that's happened, but they still keep thinking that it might. So eventually, to answer Edward's question, the Russians are going to have to just move to end it, and the only way they're going to end it is to destroy the Kiev regime and destroy its ability to fight, destroy its ability to govern. That's the only way this is going to work, and it's the last thing the Russian capitalist class wanted to do, because they want to get back to moving their money into the West and buying houses again, but again, perversely, it is the imperialists themselves who are weakening the Russian capitalist class with regard to this. Good day to Sid, who joins us. Nasukani Brod says that I resemble Halit Ergenç, a famous Turkish actor. Well, I'm going to have to look this up now. Halit Ergenç. Let me have a look. Yeah, maybe. It's not a bad comparison. I mean, he's a bit older than me, but yeah, I'll take that. It's I didn't realize I was going for a Turkish movie star look, but apparently I am. Right. So, where are we now? Right. Nihat says Turkish TKP led by Oktay Okuyan is endorsing an anti-imperialist stance. First time in Turkey a leftist organization is doing so. Turkey has been and still somewhat is under NATO yoke. Okay, so is this a change in position by the Turkish Communist Party? I must admit, I'm not completely up to speed with their history. So if there's anything I can read on that, I will catch up with it. Right. Hello to Comrade Davy, who joins us. Agricola says Mike Waltz being fired. Will Hegseth be fired too? I got the impression that Colonel Daniel Davis is on standby. I don't think they'll let Daniel Davis have it, to be honest. I think Waltz being fired I think basically because he fucked up with that group chat nonsense. Waltz out, Hegseth will go because it's not because he's particularly oppositional to anything that goes on in the Pentagon. It's that he's a slovenly drunk and too publicly too much of an idiot in public. They won't give it to Colonel Davis because he's taken far too many critical positions against people in very significant positions of power inside the United States. So, I mean, maybe Trump brings him in as an advisor. Because if Secretary of Defense, that's a position that has to be confirmed. So if Hegseth gets booted, then they would have to go through Senate confirmation. And Davis, I don't think, would get through the Senate confirmation. Now, he could theoretically make him national security advisor, but I don't think Trump's got the balls to do that either. I think you're going to end up with Waltz's replacement being like a like-for-like replacement. And if Hegseth gets the boot, then you'll end up with some ex-military officer or lobbyist or both being defense secretary. I mean, Trump's just announced that the defense budget is going to go up to $1 trillion. You can hear the cash registers ringing over at Boeing and the other big defense contractors. So that's who will get the job. It won't be somebody who's even like a principled critic from like the libertarian or conservative side of things. Clementine says we could ask Japan to weaken China and China wouldn't know what hit them. The Chinese aren't aggressive people, but Russia won't help China. I completely and utterly disagree with you. The Chinese made a very successful war against the Japanese and then against to defend themselves against imperialism. By the way, there's no such thing as like an aggressive and an unaggressive people. There's no such thing as a warlike and an unwarlike people. There are warlike phases in history, in the history of countries, and there are more peaceful phases in the history of countries. This we're not a warlike people stuff. This is nonsense because it implies like there is some sort of essential soul to a nation, which there just isn't. Like the Chinese have fought many great wars over their very, very long history. So this Chinese aren't an aggressive people thing. They're not capable of warfare. I don't think this is correct. I think this is something that the Chinese government says from time to time, but the Chinese are more than capable of waging a war and more than capable of winning one. Right. Okay. David King says, Agricola says, even Wagenknecht bemoaned Putin's illegal attack on Ukraine. No courage in the political scene. Yes, and it comes from the fact that, look, the Ukraine war has been decided upon as a priority for imperialism for, ever since this was started. This was identified as the thing that was going to turn things around for the West, which is why they're all lined up behind it. They have to secure the destruction of the Russian Federation. Without that, they're fucked, to put it bluntly. And so when the ruling class brings the hammer down, and all of the different bourgeois political forces simply fall into line. So everybody from Schultz to Wagenknecht and everything and everything on the right wing of Germany all fell into line, just as it happened. This is the same effect happened here with regard to the political parties in the bourgeois system. Labour Party, Tories, Liberals, Greens, Scottish nationalists, Welsh nationalists, all of whom were waving the Ukraine flag and screaming, "We stop Putin's war." By the way, the fake Communist Party, the Communist Party of Britain, was saying similar things and calling for a one-sided unilateral withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. Well, who do you think would benefit from that? So all of the forces inside the bourgeois system, including the fake communists in this country, all supported the government's line and still do with regard to the Ukraine war. So everybody from the liberals to the Trotskyites and the revisionists are all on board with this. Same is true in Germany. Will Will Russia declare war and go in harder and ditch the special military operation? Well, they're already escalating in regard to their attacks on areas that potentially have civilians within them. I think they're going to have to. It's been a slow process whereby the Russian government gradually has to accept the fact that there's no easy way out of this, and the imperialists aren't going to let them have an easy way out of this. Agricola says, on the negotiation topics, nothing has changed in the US stance since December 2021, Trump or not, which is exactly right. The US stance in late 2021 was that they were prepared to talk to the Russians about certain elements of arms control, but nothing else. So this melodrama that has been engaged in with regard to the fate of NATO, like all the screaming about, Trump's going to abandon NATO. Trump's not going to abandon NATO. I've said this a couple of occasions, and I will keep saying it, because NATO is there to secure US investments in Europe, which are still substantial. Now, NATO may fall to pieces eventually because it's been revealed as being quite impotent, but the US isn't pulling the plug on it. No, and it's not just because it's too profitable for the US in terms of its ability to make money off of NATO. It's also the fact that this is about securing US investments in Europe, and as long as those are totaling over $1 trillion they're going in and coming out again, i.e., capital going out of the US into Europe and $1 trillion coming back out of Europe into the US, then there's no way that NATO is being given up. No way at all. Again, look at the numbers involved. Look at why NATO really exists. It's not just to make US arms companies lots of money, which is what Trump keeps going on about. It's about securing US investments. It's about making sure that the European countries remain on the straight and narrow, so to speak, and that US interests aren't ever threatened. And that need is there, and so NATO will remain, regardless of what Trump says or how many mean tweets he puts out, or how many tiffs he has with Friedrich Merz. That need is all still there. Now, will the EU go a bit rogue and sign a deal with the Chinese? This is an interesting question. I haven't come to a conclusion about that. There are, of course, and always has been, tensions that exist between the European powers and the United States. There's even tensions between the British ruling class and the US ruling class. They just generally keep their rows behind closed doors, but there are tensions there. For instance, there's tensions there that exist over nations like Kenya, which was dominated in a neo-colonial fashion by the British for the longest time, but now the Americans are making moves there with their puppet Ruto to bring Kenya more firmly under US control. So there are always tensions and there are always contradictions between the different elements that exist within the NATO alliance, with different ruling class elements. There's always been an element of the US ruling class which doesn't like having to indulge the Europeans, that doesn't like having to essentially prop them up from time to time, which is what they did after World War II. But they keep doing it because it's overall in their interest to do it. So there's this constant tension and push and pull that goes on between the US and the European powers, where each tries to outmuscle the other. If you look at the way that corporate mergers have gone on over the last 25 to 30 years, if you look at the capital movement between the US and the European nations, you can see that these two entities, the US and Europe, are very much intertwined with each other in terms of the number of transnational corporations that operate across the US, Britain, and the EU, in terms of, as I said, the amount of capital that gets moved via foreign direct investment between the US and the EU and Britain and back again. With regard to collective, with regard to trading relationships, etc. There's many strands that exist there, and again, it's all in tension, and they're all constantly pushing and pulling against each other. But again, the interests do remain aligned in a lot of crucial ways. So I suspect that what the EU is doing by opening up negotiations with the Chinese is essentially they're trying to play hardball with the US over these tariffs. So it may be and that works. Maybe it doesn't, or maybe this is one of those occasions where an attempt to play hardball backfires, and they end up signing a deal with the Chinese and fucking over the US to a certain extent. Again, not clear how it's going to go just yet, but I still maintain the point that the US is not giving up NATO. The US is not giving up its position in Europe. There's a lot of talk and a lot of talk about like drawing down the US presence in Europe and rebalancing. But I've yet to see much in the way of an actual policy from Trump. And I think the longer it goes on, the less likely it is that there's going to be a change in policy or a shift of US troops out of Europe. There might be a slight drawdown given that Biden beefed up the presence in Germany, but there won't be much more than that. Right. So yes, Agricola's point is correct. Why is the KPRF so weak and participates in bourgeois elections? Asks Edward. Well, I don't think they're actually. I don't think they are weak, Edward. I don't agree with you there. It is. It is the fact that the KPRF remain the major opposition party in the Russian Federation, have done so for years. They participate in bourgeois elections. Well, there's always a debate about that, about whether it is worth participating in them, whether it is worth, putting as much emphasis on them as the KPRF does. That's a decision for them. The judgment that I would make on this is, again, drawing from Lenin as to what advances the influence of the party within the Russian masses at any given moment in time. If standing in elections does that, then it's worth it. Are there reformist and revisionist tendencies within the KPRF? Certainly. But from everything I've read with regard to their positions, I think their positions have got stronger as time has gone on. And it would seem that they have, because they've been vindicated about Ukraine, spectacularly so, and the intentions of the Western partners towards the Russian Federation, I would say that they look set to actually grow stronger in the coming years. So I don't agree with the basis of your question there. Right. Nehat's talking about a big shift in leftist thought in Turkey. I'll have to check that out. Zach says Waltz was effectively acting as an Israeli spy. I would say that Waltz is probably representative of the ultra reactionary elements in the U.S. system, who of course aligned themselves with Israel because Israel is the most aggressive representation of of U.S. policy in West Asia. Agricola says, I think the Kremlin made a miscalculation thinking that the march on Kiev would result in some political solution. Giving up strategic territory wasn't a win, however they put it. Yeah, well, they kept thinking that there was going to be some kind of negotiation. They kept thinking that the Kiev regime could be negotiated with, or that some kind of solution could be reached just by essentially stopping the active persecution of Russian language speakers inside Ukraine, restoring Ukraine to neutrality, reaching a settlement with regard to Donbass. None of these things are possible because the imperialists didn't want any of them to be possible. And so they made sure that the Ukrainian government absolutely would not concede and would never sign any agreement that they would stick to for more than 10 minutes. Svetlana says the KPRF is supportive of Putin right now, given the Ukraine conflict. It'll be interesting to see what they do once the conflict is resolved. Yes, if you read the KPRF's documents, they support the continuation of special military operations to the point of victory and the destruction of the Kiev regime. They're very critical. They don't criticize Putin a lot directly. They're very critical of Russian bourgeois nationalists, petty bourgeois reactionaries, and the other tendencies that surround Putin. They are very critical of them and remain so, and are quite clear that this sort of war of national defense must be won but the major barrier to winning it isn't even really the imperialists. It's the vacillating, weak, and treacherous Russian bourgeoisie, which is the biggest barrier to them actually winning a victory. The KPRF's analysis is quite clear on that. Mr. Chopin says, I get a lot of my conservative friends and family blaming China for everything they can think of. Now I'm wondering about the single child policy. That sounds more like typical Western propaganda. Well, it was a real policy. I know I haven't done enough research to dive into like how that came about or like where the idea came from. So I'm going to make a note to come back to that point in future episodes. Hello to Steve Choate. Arcane Eclectic says, I'm pretty sure China got rid of the one-child policy back in the late 90s. Yeah, they did. It's no longer there, the one-child policy. Agricola says, during the Kiev attack, I got the sense there was a botched intelligence operation involved, maybe due to treason. I remember a vid of a shootout of an SBU agent with police at a Kiev crossroad. Yeah, I think that the Russians tried to mobilize whatever assets they had inside the SBU and the Ukrainian state, and it didn't work. I think they got probably outmaneuvered by the imperialists with regard to that. NATO is a USA cash cow. All members got to buy US weapons. That's part of it, but it's never just about that. It's also about, as I said, protecting US investments and making sure the status quo in Europe remains the same. Also exercising pressure on, as we covered when I was talking with Kit Clarenberg on the Decline and Fall show last week. There's also a concern that the Europeans should never be allowed to develop their own defense capacity. They have to remain dependent upon NATO because the US never wanted the EU to have the capacity to develop into a potential rival. And they've succeeded in that because it hasn't and it won't. Sid says there was even a pan-Germanist sect of Prussian Junkers who felt that regardless of political divisions, the patriotic group for Germany was to align itself with Russia long term. Well, they're very much in the minority. I mean, the majority of the German ruling class now certainly wants to see, well, the same thing the British ruling class wants to see, which is the defeat and the destruction of Russia. So the German ruling class hope that they can get their pickings, the fresh pickings off the corpse. They so far, thankfully, they have been disappointed. Is that why J.D. Vance hates Europe so much and calls them freeloaders? Well, Vance is a particular selection of America, a particular type of American reactionary, in that he does favor, as do some American reactionaries, there's some kind of like drawdown from in Europe. But the problem that they've got is that they can't agree on anything. As I've said on multiple occasions, that group that Vance represents can't actually push this forward. This point of view that some of them do have, because again, they're not representing the majority interests of the ruling class. They'll shout and scream and kick up and down and insult the Europeans, but it doesn't mean that American policy is going to change. It just means there's going to be more rows at diplomatic summits. Grassy Knoll says, didn't Kirill Dmitriev visit Washington, D.C.? He did indeed. And again, this was all part of like the Russian negotiation dance, which is to see if the US could be enticed into essentially giving up Ukraine. I mean, this was obviously a gambit that some in the Kremlin favored, that the idea that they were going to give up Ukraine, the idea that they were going to be able to reach the point where they would bargain with the US and they would offer the US something and it would appeal to Trump's sort of mercenary instincts. And this would secure a US exit from the Ukraine stage. But this was never going to be the case because, again, for all the reasons that I've emphasized, that was never going to play. The most that will happen is some kind of normalization or restoration of relations between the US and the Russians. But we should also emphasize that the negotiations between the US and the Russians now, the negotiations never really stopped. It's not that there was no diplomatic contact between the US and the Russian side. There was there was always a dialogue going on between the heads of the intelligence services, the CIA and the SVR, were always talking to each other. Like the military to military, they were always talking to each other. So this idea that under Biden there was no discussion whatsoever, that is not completely true. There always was, and the US has always been desperate to avoid going into an open war with the Russians because they know it's a war that they couldn't possibly win because of the Russians have the edge on them with regard to nuclear missile technology. So this is this is overstated by some, just how much there wasn't any communication or just how close the US and Russia were to a war. No, there was always back channel communication. There's always intelligence agency to intelligence agency communication. There just wasn't a big summit. But big summits are in the diplomacy world really only there to put finishing touches to deals which have been worked out by permanent officials. It's not that like Putin and Trump come up with these ideas and then sign them off and write them up themselves. Putin plays more of an active role in Russian policy formation than any US president does. But even so, like this is agreements are drawn up by the official and negotiated over for a hell of a long time before presidents meet and initial something. So we always got to bear that in mind. And the reason why Dmitriev was going to the US was to try and re-establish certain elements of commercial relations and try and reach the point where they could hopefully entice the US with some kind of offer. And of course that failed because ultimately the big prize is the destruction of Russia itself, which they know they can't get, but they can't stop pursuing it anyway. We are in Ahab and the whale territory here. Hello to Spurious Furious. Sid says, Waltz was a former Green Beret, probably connected to the most clandestine and highly criminal sects of the state. So one can imagine his mindset. Indeed, indeed. Agricola says, furthermore, after the botched operation, a kind of purge in the Russian intelligence services took place. Yeah. Hello to A.D. Kravitz. Derry's no bot. Love to see what you've done there. It says Russia is advancing towards an unconditional surrender. Well, then I welcome you into whatever drug haze that you are currently in, because you would have to be on something pretty severe to think that there's going to be a surrender. It's ridiculous troll stuff there. AD Kravitz says, how would you interact with a US conservative explaining Trump or any other US politician will not make things better? Would like to try talking to conservatives. Libs are even worse. Well, just simply draw the lines of development from George W. Bush. Use Ukraine. Okay. Use Ukraine as an example, which is because it's what we've been talking about. You go from George W. Bush, who was there when this operation kicked up a notch in the early 2000s with the Orange Revolution, to Obama, who oversaw the Maidan coup of 2014, to Trump, who, as he has boasted about, oversaw an expansion of the arming of Ukraine, to Biden, who helped launch the war, or made it possible to launch the war, back to Trump again, who doesn't change policy, or who can't change policy, whichever way you look at it. So there is complete consistency over Ukraine policy from such variable characters as George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Donald Trump again. Now, given that's 5 presidencies, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump, where the policy has remained the same. And again, Putin said it himself, and it was an accurate observation to Oliver Stone. Like, presidents change, the US policy does not, because it's about the interests of the US ruling class. But if you're talking to a conservative, maybe keep it to just use this as the opening. Like, there's no difference because essentially the machine remains the same. Now, a conservative might say, oh, it's the deep state stopping Trump. And it's like, well, that doesn't explain why Trump hires so many of its avowed representatives. Like, why the hell did he hire Mike Waltz? And I mean, this is about the fact that like the policy just simply does not change from presidency to presidency, and anybody who has any illusions in the Republican Party or Donald Trump or the Democrats should ask themselves the questions. And it's not just over Ukraine, it's over many other things. But Ukraine is the glaring example of total consistency between the two bourgeois parties. People should be asked, well, why do they think that is? Why is it that it doesn't matter who's in the presidency or who controls the House of Representatives or who controls the Senate, and the policy towards Ukraine remains the same? It is, as Alexander Vindman, the dodgy ex-military official who testified during one of the Trump impeachment hearings, that Trump had defied the foreign policy of the United States, meaning, and he gives away more than Vindman meant to, meaning that the foreign policy of the United States isn't what the president says. The president is obliged to carry out a policy which is, by and large, written for him by others, and that remains the case. And I would put it that way and see what they respond with. The mineral deal was the first major defeat for Trump. Says meme. Well, I'd say true, and also revealed his own utter ineptitude. Hello to Christopher Rogers from Hong Kong, Special Administrative Region. Right, so going to bring things to a close for today. I'm going to be back with you again tomorrow with more. Also on Ukraine, but also on other matters as well. Keep an eye out for the next episode of Decline and Fall, which will be coming out later this week. And also be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thanks to everybody who's watching on Rumble and on Locals, YouTube, Twitch, and on X, where we have, let me just see how many of you are watching out there. Let's have a look. We have 182 of you watching on X, so thank you very much for that. So back with you again tomorrow, where we will be picking up some of this again. Thanks to everybody who has tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Thanks to everybody who donated to the May Day appeal that Comrade CJ put out there on Telegram. There's been some very generous donations, and I thank you because this work is made possible by the generosity of those of you who watch it, and the more of it I can do, the better, and the donations help, and so I thank each and every one of you who has done so. And improved equipment will be forthcoming. Trust me on this one. So thank you to everybody who supports the program. Thanks to everybody who has watched tonight. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. And now I will say good night.